Hello again, and welcome again to Truth and Wholeness, which is a podcast by me, Dr. Albert LaChance. And this is episode number 4 in this. And I'm hoping that it goes well and links well with the first few that we've done. Um, so I'm simply going to begin, and this is going to be a fairly powerful session. Not that the others weren't, but I've been spending a lot of time really processing this, meditating on what I was about to say, and asking myself at every juncture, is this the truth for you? Because if you recall, in the very first episode, those of you who've seen it, I've asked for your trust, and in order to continue to depend on that, I have to know that what I'm saying, whether polite or not, is really what it is I'm feeling and thinking. And I'm beginning as I look out on the world, as most of you, as you look out in the world, I'm seeing a terrible amount of confusion, of genocide, of huge migrations of people. And in this country, I'm from New Hampshire. That's where we're broadcasting this. I become very, very concerned about the concentration camps on the southern border of our country, where all these beautiful brown people, the beautiful brown children, are being imprisoned and in many cases maltreated, dramatically maltreated. And the denial that continues to come from the highest levels in Washington really fill me with a concern for this great nation. And this is the great nation and the great promise of God to the planet. That's what the United States is, because in the United States, everyone from anywhere on the planet is represented. We're all here. And it's become more and more clear to me as I ask myself, what is the actual destiny of the United States of America? I'm convinced that it is not in having more weapons and inflicting fear in order to accomplish goals, but instead to gather all the peoples together and create or discover the protocols for a global understanding among cultures, which I call in this talk today wells of value, or uh, the various cultural contributions being value volcanoes, really. So anyway, we're going to begin. I'm going to begin with a topic from desolation to discovery, and then from discovery to recovery. And it's part of the lead up to what I have been calling the answer. I have this idea as to how we could move forward as a culture, as a planet filled with cultures, and as a people who are trying to set the tone for something great. And that's what the United States is. It's not about being able to manipulate people to our will, because that will is not the will of the Constitution and cannot be the will of God. It can't be. All the cultures, whether they're in China, India, Middle East, anywhere, they all have certain rubrics of concern and value, in particular for the poor and the vulnerable. In the Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition, they're called Anawim, the little ones. Anawim, Nawim, the little ones, the vulnerable ones, the hungry ones. And that's true in all traditions. And I promise you, I've spent 50 years looking to try to find out a commonality among the traditions that would guarantee the viability of the earth itself, the biosphere on the earth, and the life systems that support it: soil, air, water, sunlight. and then the emergence of life and all the living creatures, and the emergence of consciousness, self-reflexive consciousness, that bring us to the religions of the world and their values. And there is a commonality. Once we drop the expectation of whose ritual is right and whose is wrong, and start looking instead at the values produced in each of these traditions, regardless of their approach to it or their notion of what the sacred is. Once we get to the values, there is a commonality globally that really does support the experiment of life on this planet, all of it being sacred. So, what I'm most concerned with when I look around are the mass murder of the week, suicide, addiction death, and insane ideas for leadership that would, under any close examination by moral experts. See, you notice that when the experts are gathered, very seldom do they ever include a moral expert. There'll be the various sciences represented, and all that's good. We have to understand the world we're living in materially. But the moral expert understands the invisibility of truth and how to navigate in the world of the invisible. And we're calling it things like right now black matter and whatever, black energy, dark matter, energy. And the fact is that there is no name for it, but we know it's there and we can't see it. It's invisible. And the moral expert has taken the time to understand the invisible and the various pathways through the invisible that we all need to know in order to survive. So I'm going to make some wild suggestions today in this, and I'm sure there'll be more coming in the other in the following, the subsequent podcasts. But I want to start out with a notion of perestroika. It's a Russian word, and it was used by Gorbachev to talk about the spiritual awakening of the Russian people. Now, here you had a communist state that was usually governed by at least official atheism. And you have this guy come along and suddenly start talking about the spiritual renewal of the Russian people. And it's no surprise that ultimately he got laughed off stage, and Boris Yeltsin came to Boris, true to his name. And so this perestroika for the United States is something that I think we need to begin to think about. And I know somebody's now going to say, well, he's a communist or whatever it might be. I don't know anybody that loves this country more than I do. I absolutely find it to be the most brilliant form of government, but we have made huge mistakes that in the moral sphere are collective blasphemies. And we have to begin to understand that the condition of our nation was brought on by us. This is not a visitation by any one person. This is not the sickness of any one person. We have brought this upon ourselves. And I'm going to irritate people. That's my job. When I start pointing out the reasons why I would use a word like blasphemy. So, in the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, which I believe now to be one of the cutting edge ideas of the 20th century, and the 12 steps are now being practiced in 190 uh, nations on Earth, and there are only 193 or something like that at last count. And you would expect them not to be able to function in places like North Korea or whatever. Like I said, I'm not a communist. And they end with number 12. The 12th step is spiritual awakening. And that's the name of my practice that I'm in with my wife. We have a spiritual counseling service called Spiritual Awakening. And that's what has to happen in order for us to get our bearings. And there are um, some factors that have to be solved before that awakening can happen. So I'm going to be talking about those and other things today. So these wells of wisdom, that's the words I was looking for. These wells of wisdom are traditionally the well, in China it would be Lao Tzu, Chuang Tzu, Mencius, and many others, all the derivatives that come out of Taoism. In India, it would be Krishna, Brahman, and then eventually Buddhism that arises out of it, and Sikhism, and all the other derivatives. And these wells of wisdom can be thought of that way. If you thought of several, like volcanoes, maybe in different places on the earth, that were producing within the ecological, the eco-psychological context of each of those cultures, producing ways in which to codify real understandings of the invisible. And so coming down to us, many of these have lost their oh they lost their ability to attract, their calling power. I first heard that term by a man named Richard Rohr, who I would like to give a shout out to. He has his own podcast as a Franciscan monk, gone critic, gone prophet, and he's got some fabulous wisdom. So as their calling power diminishes because of the injuries that they've experienced in their evolution and therefore perpetrated on their own people, such as the great sexual scandal that came up in Catholicism. But there are many, many different ways in which it can be viewed. And each of these traditions, each of these wells of wisdom has a way to point to what my wife and I are now calling the divine therapist. And it comes out of the work of Keating, Michael Keating, I forget his name, Thomas Keating, who recently passed away. He's a Catholic monk, and the idea is that these wells of meaning and drinking from them, which is a typical image for the Middle East, the gospel and Judaism, drinking the waters of eternal life. Well, that's what the wisdoms are the waters of eternal life. And it doesn't matter if it's around a mass or around a bonfire or around any of the different gathering places for spiritual healing and value seeking and value integrating that goes on in each of the cultures. Each of them is a different well, and each of them is producing a value to human life, to animal life, to plant life, to the biosphere, the life systems of the planet, all of it. They're bringing a certain understanding as to how to live here creatively among the other species, but also among the other traditions. The day is over when anyone can claim 100% truth at the detriment to anyone else's traditions. It doesn't work that way anymore. And young people know it, and the churches and synagogues and maybe even the mosques are emptying. I don't know. But I know that globally, they're all producing the same value because I've looked and I've spent day after day, year after year, decade after decade studying them all to try to understand what it is they have in common. And what they have in common are values. So when we find ourselves in a culture of addiction, in a culture of suicide, in a culture of despair, meaninglessness, and utter anxiety, then my suggestion is that we begin to look back to what are the values inherent in the various traditions and begin by seeking out that which we left behind in order to understand. I mean, I wouldn't wear the same shoes I would have chosen at 16, not at 72. Things change. So when you go back and look at them, you're looking at them through a different pair of eyes. And then once we can isolate the values and start hearing about others who are isolating the values, we've got one of the ingredients that will be necessary. And the reason it's necessary first is because in the matrix of the Alcoholics Anonymous 12 steps, in step 3, which is we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of the sacred as we understand it. It says God, but God isn't the name of God anywhere. It's just a collective noun. But also in 11, continue through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with the sacred as we understand it, asking only for knowledge of its will for us and the power to carry that out. It is a complete turning of the tables on egotism. And it's egotism that is giving us our signals now in the way to act and causing us to inflict an untold amount of harm on every level of life. So in meditation in particular, the divine therapist appears, and it's probably the very best name for the God of all of our understandings in some way, because as we practice meditation and prayer and the other rituals that are indigenous to our own lives, then this invisible something, which I call the fourth voice, the cognitive brain is the first voice. The affective brain is the second voice. The instinctual brain is the third voice, the brain stem. And there is a fourth voice. And hopefully you're hearing it now. And because you too are hearing it, it indicates that we live in one soul. We live in one life system. And that the values that are inherent that any of us will discover with enough focus will then enable us to recognize the same values in the others. So then the process begins. In the admission of powerlessness in step 1, we kind of are able to just let go. Say, we didn't do this. It wasn't done on purpose. That we can't change it just by being one person. So what we have to do is let go of the guilt and the anxiety that comes with looking at the world with eyes that are grounded in the values that are in the wells of wisdom, the various wells of wisdom. So the divine therapist, that idea brought me to a memory of one of the sayings of my own teacher, Thomas Berry. And that saying, I kind of stopped using it. I used to use it a lot. I don't use it, haven't used it recently. And it's the dream drives the action. We're always waiting for the psychic energy to try to do things better. Most of us are well intentioned, some of us aren't. As we search for how to do the right thing, we find that we don't have the power to be able to do it. We live in a representative democracy, representational democracy, that doesn't represent us, for one thing, but it's even closer to home than that. We wake up and we look out at things, mass movements, migrations everywhere in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, genocides everywhere. And I sit back sometimes, and I'm pretty well intentioned. I sit back and I say, what does, one guy, no matter how you work at it, no matter how much you study, pray, and meditate, or whatever, this is too much. It's simply too much. Well, you know what? Every single addict of any kind arrives at that place. It's called hitting bottom. And they just say, I know I've been running around saying I got a handle on this, and I know I've been running around saying I'm not hurting anybody but myself, and I know that all of these things are true, and that I don't want to live without the ability to blah, 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 whatever it might be. At some point, and I had that point, I hit that point on December 4th, 1978. And it was, I can't do this anymore. I can't do it. I'm not able to do it. And I broke. And I've broken many times since as I've become overwhelmed in one way or another. That's why I suggest the methodology in the 12 steps, because it's a simple approach that starts with giving up. We admitted we were powerless over an insane culture, and that our lives and all of life have been degraded. That's the first step in my book, Cultural Addiction. And once we do that, there's a liberation of some of those energies that are tied up in anxiety and or crushed by the return to active addiction and the loss of the fourth voice, because the fourth voice is the soul. It's the way in which the divine therapist speaks to us, reaches us. And there's just something about the neurological truth of our brains that as soon as they are overly affected by any chemical that is, recreational chemical, I'm not talking about, needing insulin, if you're a diabetic or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about any of the play games, any of the toys, alcohol, drugs, the rest of it, that the brain blocks blocks the ability to hear the voice that speaks as who we actually are. There's nothing living in this form. It's all chemistry. There's nothing living in here except me. I'm in here. And that's the voice I can't hear once I'm intoxicated. I can't hear my own voice, which ultimately, in the wells of wisdom, teach us that we are each a dimension of the divine therapist, and we have the divine therapist in the fourth dimension of our own existence. So that's the beginning. So the dream drives the action. Usually we're thinking that, if only we have this, that, and the other thing, we can make this work. But you know what? 50 years ago, 50 years ago, one guy's dream of going to the moon bore fruit. And it starts as a dream, and around that dream, the actual ingredients necessary to further the dream begin to emerge. And that was Kennedy, John Kennedy. And I had this dream, let's go to the moon. What? Go to the moon? Yeah, let's go to the moon. Not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Let's do it. And we did. We did. So our job then, taking the values of the wells of wisdom, is to clear the path through the brain and through the heart to reach the soul, because that's where the wisdom abides. We could say it this way, that's where God lives. That's where God lives. And we're looking at a culture that can't hear it anymore. And yet we hear it. 4th of July, we find these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal and endowed by, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one. We hear it and we get chills, and we throw some firecrackers around. But to actually hear it in a way that enables us to understand the true greatness of what this is, the true greatness of what America really is, remains completely opaque to the eyes and silent to the ears, because we cannot hear the voice of our own being. What else is important? If that's true, if what I said is true, what else is important? There's nothing else that's important. We need to hear the voice of the ages within us. So, clearing the pathway is what the steps are about. Steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Clear the pathway. Step 11 is about prayer and meditation to improve the contact. Step 12 is the promise, not suggestion, the promise of spiritual awakening. And the only way you can know what a spiritual awakening is to have one. And we cannot have one until we've cleansed the pathway through the neurology of the brain and the thinking heart. And we open ourselves out. I think I mentioned last time, sunyata, Sunyata is a Sanskrit word for that opening. And kenosis is the Greek or Christian use of the exact same term. It's what confession's supposed to be and isn't. It's been silly and trivialized. So if you want to find out what I'm going to say about the wells of wisdom next week, you can get a jump on the project by looking in chapter 11 of my book, Cultural Addiction. It lists all the major cultures, some of their derivatives, including the native peoples, and it shows how there are three basic relationships that have to be present in order to be awake. One is the person-to-person relationship. Two is the human-earth relationship. And the third one is the human and cosmos relationship. So that's one piece of this triangle that will only light up if we do the work. It's easy enough to say this is nonsense. Many do. But those who have done it do not. And those are the people we revere, the Einsteins and the Ramakrishnas and the T.S. Eliots and all these other people, the great saints and all of them. The Buddha, Krishna, Lao Tzu, all of them, they awakened. They awakened. And so we look at them and we say, oh, well, these were extraordinary people. No, they weren't. They had a cognitive affect. They had a cognitive brain, they had an affective brain, and they had an instinctual brain. And each of them had a soul that, because of the peculiarity of what they chose to do with their lives, the focus, the thing that's most important, the pearl of invaluable price, the pearl of great price, they awaken to the realization that that which is deepest in them is the presence of the sacred, the 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 um, the therapist. So I think I also mentioned that oneness, Oneness, leads to wonder, Oneder. I'm just doing a little word game there with the word wonder. Wonder emerges from oneness. And to feel that wonder again is the power that fuels the vision. It's what it's the dream that drives the action. And so Thomas Berry writes this book, The Dream of the Earth. What's the dream of the earth? Us. We are the earth dreaming. The other animals are the earth dreaming. The magnificent beauty is the dream. So we're in a place where we have to really give up on what we think we know and can do, because we can't. It's not possible. The UN itself has said within 10 years, we're going to go from creativity in the planet to catastrophe. Well, what is that but an apocalyptic statement? And it's not coming out of the churches. It's not coming out of the churches. It's coming out of the UN. And then they announce that there are a million species that are going to be presently disappearing, that 60% of the food fish in the ocean will be gone by the time we get around to the next century. Starvation everywhere. Um, we need the energy of the dream. And whatever it is we've been doing has got to be discarded, frankly. And most people have. They've lost faith in the government. They've lost faith in the church. They've lost faith in themselves, in each other, in the careers. The economics aren't working for everyone. They're working. What is the statistic? Uh, Three families own 50% of the wealth of the nation. I mean, why would we look at the overthrow of kings in Europe and then go repeat the exact same thing again and again? Because we haven't cleared the pathway to the soul. One of the great prophets in music actually said, we've overturned the order of the soul. So, since the moon landing, there are four things that we know and can't unknow. The first is we are one ecologically. There's just no way around it. We've seen the Earth from space, and we didn't see any walls, and we didn't see any fences. We didn't see any of that. What we saw was a planet that flows into itself. Its atmosphere flows into itself. Its water system, its hydrology floats in and out of itself. And the life systems, all of them, including the air, the water, and the others, they're all without barrier until we bar them. Until we bar them. So we're one ecologically, and we can deny it. We can, anyone can come up with a denial, you know. The second one is, like it or not, we are one economically. And that's why we're having trouble in places like the southern border and many other places, because those who have the money do not want to share, and they do not want to even in the slightest amount decrease their overweening of themselves and their own families. They don't want to, in fact, they want it to grow. They want the wealth to grow for those three families. The answer has to be no. And, the people, certain politicians will come out and say, oh, well, that's redistribution of wealth. Yes, yes, it's the redistribution of wealth. Precisely what it is. The third is we are one technologically. And I used to, when I was speaking nationally, I used to use this simple idea. I have this friend that I love like I love my own heart. His name is PK. And I used to use this, I say, PK's over there in Hawaii. And here am I in Missouri or wherever I happen to have been speaking at that point. And I said, I can reach into my pocket, flip open my very antique cell phone, and I can call him anytime, night or day. Now, there are a lot of downsides to that, and I'm going to mention one of them is the radiation that it's doing. And for all of you out there, please stop carrying your cell phones in your back pocket. You're broadcasting radiation to your genitals and your rectum every minute that they're back there. And there are women who carry them in their bras, which makes a lot of sense. It's built to be a holder, right? And you stick it in there, and it's no. There's a unique form of radiation now that is producing a unique form of cancer, and it's coming right from putting it there. When you're not making a call or receiving one, shut it off. Just shut it off, because it is broadcasting all the time their fields of energy dynamics, and so are we. So all the while, let alone what's coming in from what's moving through us from one cell phone tower to the next. Forget about even that. These are directly close to us, broadcasting into our brains. And it's such a simple thing. It might look cool to have you in your back pocket and you got your little phone. It's not cool. In fact, it's very hot. It's actually very hot. So that's number three. We are one technologically. We can be in touch with each other, and boy, that's got its downsides for introverts like me. Believe me. And the last one is we are not one morally or spiritually, but we can be. We can be one morally and spiritually if we take the time to know at least our own traditions, the ones that we were brought up in, take another look at them because usually we've been hurt by them or we've been offended by the stupidity of the way these teachings have been taught. That's usually what it is. So when you look back at it as an adult, you say, oh, of course, wasn't I a bright little kid? I knew this was nonsense the way they were doing it. And then start looking. And it really winds up to be this because of the fourth voice in us, the voice of the soul, we can really underscore the Zen Buddhist notion that you're already enlightened. You need only clear the pathway. You need only realize it, make it real. Well, you can say that, but if you don't do anything after that, then okay, I'm enlightened. What next? Well, what next is clearing the pathway, allowing the divine therapist to speak to you in meditation and elsewhere, and listen and start doing the heavy lifting of growing up, maturing. So, what I'd like to announce here is that I hear a lot of people, New Age and otherwise, talk about how we need to reach a new level of consciousness collectively. What I want to say is we already have. We are the new level of consciousness. Once we incorporate the teachings, the wells of wisdom, once we incorporate that wisdom and make that numero uno in our lives, number one, integrity, decency, living for others as well as oneself, caring for the animals, caring for the water, the soil, the sky, all of it. All of a sudden, we begin to realize, oh, I've already known all this. So once we know it, we're in a position to make it real. And that's what realization is. You get these people saying, well, they realize. If your teacher is realized and you're not, you got a bad teacher. You got somebody who's teaching you nothing. If they can't impart awakening, they're not imparting anything. Find a new teacher in any of the wells. Just find one. So Teilhard de Chardin is my teacher. And his probably greatest student or follower was Thomas Berry, who was my actual teacher for 6 years. But I've been studying Teilhard de Chardin now since 1973, and I'm really deeply into it. And he's my teacher, and I've awakened in him while still studying all the other wells for decades. So what's happened is something has emerged that is bigger than any of them, includes them all, and is true in each and every one of them. And what that is the great secret. You have to find that out for yourself. But there's nothing better to do with your life than to give up. Unless you lose your life, you don't gain it. Unless the wheat berry dies, it does not produce the plant. So there is a triangle that begins with the study of and the realization of the wells of wisdom. Then one is in a position to do what we have to do, and the first thing we have to do is sober up. We've got to sober up. I won't take on students who aren't willing to sober up. And when I say sober up, I mean, no marijuana and no alcohol. They all cut off the pathway to the soul. And I'm not talking to you as somebody who hasn't done it. Regrettably, in some ways, I did plenty of it for a decade, specifically from age 21 to 31, and have never done any of it again. And this is the reward. What I'm able to know and understand and communicate to you is my reward. So, if we create this triangle right up top, sober up, got to sober up. And there's no simple way to do that other than to sober up and stop thinking that our well being is involved in scrambling the neurology of our own brains. It's torment. That's a descent into hell. And most recovering people will tell you that it was exactly that. Then we can apply the 12 steps because we have an understanding of what the sacred is for us. For us. Then adding that to the teachings of uh, C.G. Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, we have a psychological model to work through the damage that we've done to ourselves and have had done to us by the churches, by the economy, by the government, by all of the others who have impeded us in becoming who we really are. So it's a three-way triangle. We sober up, we implement the methodology, the simple methodology of what Bill Wilson, he was a founder, brought on board, and then we get counseling in something resembling the work of C.G. Jung, Jungian psychology. And what's the greatest accomplishment of Jungian psychology? It is Alcoholics Anonymous itself, because Carl Jung had a relationship with Bill Wilson at the outset. But none of it is accessible to us. None of it will help us. None of it will do anything if we don't sober up. So if you laid that triangle, as I have it here, on the table, then there is a fourth voice. And in the Alcoholics Anonymous literature, it talks about being rocketed into a fourth dimension of experience. And it says that on page 8 and on page 25 of what's called the Big Book, the textbook, Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, that sort of rises up out of the triangle. If you lay the triangle flat, I wish I had a way to show it to you. I do. If we lay the thing flat, then that centerpiece, that writing in the center makes it three-dimensional or four-dimensional. We rise out of the dilemma that we found ourselves in into a transcendent function, an idea or an experience that enables us to understand the thought, feelings, and experience of everyone else, regardless of what language, what religion, what anything they belong to. It doesn't matter, because we're all the same organism. And we discover that when we get to the transcendent function. And it doesn't mean exactly the same thing that it means in the Jungian context. So if we can get that depth in our being to rise up into this fourth dimension, then we begin also to understand that the United States of America really is the greatest nation on earth. And I would add to that by saying, I believe that the divine therapist has drawn this out of the earth itself, out of the North American continent, to be a place where people can work out the difficulties of what we have to work out in order to become globally one people in some fashion. So We're not the greatest nation on earth because of our nuclear arsenal or any of our other arsenals. We're the greatest nation on earth only because of the calling. And believe me, my generation heard that call. Most of them have denied it and run back off after BMWs or trinkets or whatever. Most of us heard that call. And the mission that it implied, which was to begin to serve the planet and its peoples and its animals and its birds and its air and its water and soil, all of it, to begin to serve that because, as science will now tell us, cosmology tells us, that all of this emerged out of the divine therapist. We call it the fireball, the emergence, or the Big Bang. God, I hate that term. The fireball. But out of the fireball came the primordial matrix of particles in the early universe, which became ultimately the galaxies, the Earth, life, and culture. So when we're hearing from the divine therapist, we're hearing from the other side of the fireball. We're hearing in what Teilhard de Chardin calls alpha, just the beginning, alpha. Why can't we use those terms? Alpha and omega, the beginning and the end. So all it is drawing that forth in us, making ourselves three-dimensional, four-dimensional, because it's already there. We already are that. That is the hardest thing to grasp. It's also the simplest. We already are that. The population, the mission, the calling and the mission were to all the populations of the earth. That is the greatness of these United States because they're all here already. Those populations include all the religions of the world, all the races of the world, all the cultures of the world, the continents of the world. We're already one. There's no special thing that we're going to accomplish other than to realize it and realize the call from the fourth voice, from the soul. And then the mission becomes making that real, realizing it. We must welcome our brown immigrants as a migratory movement coming to help and returning to their own land. I remember the story about Chief Seattle, I think it was, where when the white man was doing business with him and saying that you own the land, and he honestly, it wasn't a joke on his part, I don't think. He said, really, how far down do we own it? A mile, 2 miles? I mean, how deep is the ownership? And the point is, not very deep, because there's ultimately no such thing. Ultimately, the United States is the manifestation of the North American continent, its soil, its water, and its biological plenty. It's no wonder if the North American continent is getting disassembled, it shouldn't be a surprise that we feel out of center, that we feel discouraged and depressed. And a trainload of Zoloft and Prozac are not going to change that, though there's a place for Zoloft and Prozac too. When people are going off a cliff, you got to give them something to help you back if they're really that close to the cliff. But ultimately, our health comes from what we already are. And that needs to be supported and is by the medical establishment, the chiropractic establishment, the acupuncture establishment, the people who are trying to make our foods better, and all of these other people already trying to do good things. But ultimately, they'll all fail if we don't find that which we already are. So, the new American leadership among nations must be founded on a new vision and not on the Wall Street averages. They're just numbers. And we do need to find a way to redistribute wealth. People are dying of hunger everywhere. We've got a president who stands there with a hamburger in each hand, watching it, and thinking somehow that if he lets them suffer enough, they'll stop coming. We must end World War II and begin disarmament. We were the first to use the bomb, and we must be the first and the leadership in ultimate, complete disarmament. Now, am I some flake that thinks that, oh, next Tuesday we're going to take them all down or whatever? No, obviously not. But there has to be a real effort, like there was only a decade or two ago, to start dismantling these things. We've never disarmed, and we're still building. I mean, what do we have, tanks now in our 4th of July? 60-ton vehicles in Washington? Is that the dress rehearsal for the next 4th of July when more tanks show up? Bothers my sleep. We must give teeth to the United Nations and foster and protect it, especially since it is nested in our soils on our continent. We must become sober from all the addictions to escapism, including but not limited to sex addiction, drug addiction, greed, shopping, consumerism, power, and so many others. There's nothing to escape once we have ourselves. There's nothing to escape. We're here. We must also protect habitat for all creatures. Without habitat, any creature is an abstraction. Raina Maria Rilke once wrote a poem called The Panther and talked about this magnificent creature pacing around its cage, and every so often its eyes would lose their light and it would just lie down knowing it was not going to escape. Well, if they don't have habitat, they're an abstraction. That's not a panther. A panther plus concrete and bars? That's not a panther. Yeah, they're dangerous, and they should be. And we need to respect that if we're walking around in the woods, unless we want to have them tranquilized and held so that we can then shoot them and feel like we're the great white hunter. Like the Brillcream brothers do. So, the perestroika is the awakening. Isn't it preferable to fascism? You say, well, that's an awful lot you're asking from us today. No, it isn't. It's about waking up. It's about being yourself and really understanding. My teacher, Thomas Berry, once told me, he said, the only thing you have to do in a spiritual life is truly be yourself. We're not our thoughts. We're not our affects. We're not our instincts. We are that which is aware of them. That's who we are. So a little bit of self-control sure beats any amount of fascism. July 1969, I witnessed the moon landing while tripping on LSD. July 2019, I am 40 years sober without a single drink or drug in that 40-year span, not even for surgeries. On that 4th of July, which was 2 days ago from this talk, the earth quaked. Literally, the earth quaked. And we can use that as a kind of reminder of who's really in charge. Before we could walk on the moon, there had to be a massive plan, distinct and globally coordinated, which we had to follow step by tiny, um, detailed step. It was fueled by the dream of a president. By the time it touched down, the two beautiful Kennedy brothers were dead. And Martin Luther King, their black equivalent, was also. The two Kennedy brothers were murdered by bullets going through their skulls and blasting the bone of the skull apart and tearing the brain, parts of the brain out. I'm told that Bobby Kennedy's last words were, "How's everybody else?" These were big dreamers. And we've got some pipsqueaks, and they're always with us. You know, boneless people, McConnell, others like him, Graham, Lindsey Graham. They're always around. All we really need to do is to dream of a world disarmed and vibrant and open to all. So I'll bring this to a close by saying that on my blog, which is not this podcast, my blog called Teilhard Today, you can read the Jonah journey. I've laid it out. It took me 9 years, 1,400 lines, 31 poems to lay out this journey to the heart and to the soul. It is the pathway I walked from desperation to awakening, which is what I said this would be about at the beginning. I articulated it as my own journey under the profound influence of Joseph Campbell and Eric Neumann. On YouTube, you will find a 13-part course on Unitive Psychology, and the introduction of the 12 subsequent parts is called The Cosmology of the Soul. On Blog Talk Radio, you will find my expanded version of the 12 steps, more inclusive than just those who are recovering. So, that is the journey from desolation to discovery, from discovery to recovery. And I can't imagine being bombarded with this many words, but it's really quite simple. There are 3 ingredients that lead to a transcendent and evolutionary fourth, and in the understanding of that made real, we come to the true greatness of what it means to be an American, to be a being of the North American continent, of the planet, of the galaxy, of the cosmos, and out of the divine therapist from which the cosmos emerged. Blessing to each of you.